Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling a subject that is, well, it's absolutely crucial for anyone operating in a fast-changing world.
And that's pretty much everyone these days.
It really is. A world that's just defined by complexity, by speed, and geopolitical friction. We were talking about adaptive leadership. How do you lead when the rule book, when it's not only incomplete, but might actually be wrong?
That is the core challenge, isn't it? I mean, the modern operational environment, whether you're in business, government, or uniform, it demands leaders who don't just solve problems. They have to fundamentally change how their organization operates.
It's a whole different level of thinking.
It is. The sheer speed and variety of challenges, from competition below armed conflict all the way up to a high-stakes crisis, it requires a level of intellectual and organizational flexibility that we just haven't seen before.
So our mission today is, well, it's ambitious. We're going to unpack the essential principles of adaptive leadership. We're going to differentiate the types of challenges that demand this unique approach, and then use some proven frameworks to, navigate the terrain of complexity.
And for this deep dive, we've really blended leadership theory with high-stakes practice. Our sources are pretty robust. We're drawing heavily from U.S. Army doctrine, specifically some key excerpts from Army leadership and the profession and the doctrine publication operations.
Right, the foundational texts.
They really are. They provide a powerful, tested framework for leadership. And we're combining that with some sharp civilian analysis from the works of Heifetz, McCollum, and Shea on adaptive leadership theory.
It's a real blend of theory and doctrine then. So here's the central question we're pursuing for you, the learner. How do effective leaders manage challenges that require fundamental change?
And not just any change.
No, change to their beliefs, their values, their organizational culture. Not just deploying some known solution from a manual. And maybe more importantly, what are the dangers if they fail to make that vital distinction?
That distinction is everything. I mean, everything. If you misdiagnose a challenge, you inevitably apply the wrong solution, which in a high-stakes environment, it guarantees failure. This entire deep dive is about giving you the tools to diagnose the problem correctly.
Okay, so let's unpack this core difference right away, because it's the intellectual foundation for everything else that follows. We often think of leadership as just, problem solving. But according to the materials, there are two radically different kinds of problems.
That's right.
So let's start with the familiar one. Help us define the technical challenge.
Well, technical challenges are what most management structures are really designed to handle. By their very definition, the solution already exists. The know-how, the expertise, the procedures, they are already in place within the organization.
Or at least they're easily available to it.
Exactly. They're accessible. So if I have a technical challenge, the solution lives, as you said, inside my current way of operating or inside a manual I already possess.
Okay, so give me an example.
Think of it like a maintenance issue on a complex piece of equipment. If a team is facing a technical problem, authoritative decision-making, standard operating procedures, or deploying a specialist who has solved this issue 100 times before, that will be enough.
It might be really hard, but it's knowable.
Precisely. It could be incredibly difficult, highly specialized, mission-critical, but the resolution requires following a known, established process. The organizational culture or the individual soldier's values, they don't need to change for that broken part to be fixed.
That makes sense. It's hard work, but it's not philosophically challenging work.
Good way to put it.
Now let's flip that. Let's talk about the truly difficult terrain, the adaptive challenge. This is where leaders often fail, isn't it? Even the smart, experienced ones?
Oh, absolutely, because adaptive challenges are fundamentally different, and frankly, they're far more insidious because they force internal change. This is where the gap between the desired state and reality, it just cannot be closed using existing approaches alone.
So the solution lies outside the current organizational toolbox.
Completely outside. It requires not just a new strategy, but for the people themselves to change.
And this is the crucial, really painful part that the Heifetz and McCollum analysis highlights. Adaptive challenges exist when the people themselves are the problem. Progress requires retooling their own ways of thinking, of operating.
You're challenging deeply held beliefs, attitudes, core values. It's a psychological hurdle, not a technical one.
An immense psychological hurdle.
It really is. If the technical problem is our machine is broken, the adaptive problem is our shared belief system about how we interact with the machine or with each other is broken.
So to address that, leaders have to do what?
Well, they have to recognize the complexity first. Then they have to change their own behavior first, which is key. And perhaps most importantly, they need to develop learning organizations where responsibility for the solution is often shifted down to the stakeholders,
The people who actually have to do the adapting.
the people on the ground.
The moment you ask someone to abandon a core belief or a value they hold dear, you generate massive friction. I think that's why successful people often resist adaptation so much.
Of course, they achieve their success through the old model.
Right. So abandoning it feels like a personal betrayal.
Yeah.
Or like they're admitting a past error.
That is exactly the cognitive bias at play. And here is where it gets really dangerous. The problem of misdiagnosis. It seems easy to distinguish the two theoretically, here in a conversation.
Sure, on paper it looks clear.
But when you're under pressure, interpreting a difficult adaptive problem as a routine technical problem is probably the single greatest danger for a leader.
It leads directly to institutional blindness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You issue a technical order, and when it fails, you just double down on the technical order.
Exactly. You waste resources, you waste time, rather than realizing you need a cultural or a cognitive shift.
You see this often in history. The adaptive leadership excerpts we looked at from Snowden and Boone, they point out that interpreting a problem as routine when it demands greater attention, especially when conditions are changing, is a classic pitfall.
And we have a perfect, devastating historical example of this misdiagnosis in the construction of the Panama Canal.
Let's talk about that. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French engineer who successfully built the Suez Canal, he approached Panama with a purely technical mindset.
And it was a mindset rooted in his past success, which made it so hard for him to see otherwise. He was a brilliant engineer who brought his existing, highly successful engineering techniques and just assumed they would apply to the totally different, uncharted, incredibly hostile environment of Panama.
He was facing financial challenges, environmental challenges, and critically, health challenges that were fundamentally adaptive in nature.
And the source details the absolute tragedy of that health crisis. Yellow fever and malaria just decimated his workforce. The French team, they ignored the indicators, despite the emerging research about mosquitoes being the vector for disease.
They just kept applying their insufficient engineering and health techniques, technical solutions.
He tried to solve disease with better hospital care and sanitation, assuming the problem was bad air or poor hygiene, a known technical approach from Europe.
And the result was
Catastrophic. The source reports the deaths of over 5,000 of 22,000 workers. That wasn't an engineering failure. It was a profound failure of thinking and a refusal to adapt their core beliefs about disease transmission.
So then the United States takes over the project in 1903, and they face the exact same biological reality. And initially, they make the same mistake.
They do. U.S. political leaders and the Canal Commission were equally resistant to this new, non-traditional mosquito theory. They viewed the idea of mosquito eradication as, quote, balderdash, that would only waste time and money. They, too, were intellectually locked, treating a fundamentally adaptive health crisis as a simple logistics issue.
Just give them better conventional medicine.
Right. But then you have Dr. William C. Gorgas.
He was the adaptive leader in this story.
He absolutely was. He was the one who stood firm in the face of intense opposition, political, medical, institutional, because he realized the accepted technical solutions were entirely insufficient.
He saw that the solution wasn't just harder digging or better medicine after people got sick.
No, it was changing the entire way the organization interacted with the environment. It required a massive, non-traditional investment in sanitation, in housing, in operational belief.
So, Dr. Gorgas adapted. He changed the belief system of the entire organization.
He did. He has successfully eliminated the breeding grounds, eradicated the threat in the canal zone, and that fundamentally secured the success of the American effort. His success hinged not on superior engineering, but on superior adaptation, the willingness to challenge the institution's core beliefs.
And that's exactly why our military doctrine, Army leadership, and the profession places such a heavy emphasis on intellectual rigor and leader attributes. Adapting requires intellectual curiosity and a willingness to challenge previously held ideas.
You have to challenge your assumptions. Otherwise, you fall victim to the de Lesseps trap. A leader who is mentally agile, who can think flexibly and balance facts with new data, avoids fixating on the wrong problems or poor solutions.
So if you aren't prepared to challenge what you believe to be common sense or, what has worked in the past,
you will fail to adapt when conditions change in a hostile, complex environment. It's almost a guarantee.
Okay, so the moment you acknowledge a challenge is adaptive, you're really acknowledging that the environment itself is complex.
That's the first step.
We need a tool to understand that complexity. And this is where the Sinafin framework, which was introduced by David Snowden and Mary Boone and discussed in the adaptive leadership material, this is where it becomes incredibly valuable. It's a tool for diagnosing where you are on the terrain.
It's an essential management tool. I mean, for framing decision-making, whether you're leading a combat formation or a crisis response team in an office, it organizes challenges into 5 domains, and it helps leaders understand not just what the problem is, but how they need to respond based on the known relationship between cause and effect.
And I thought it was interesting that the material notes that rather than hard, discrete lines between these domains, they're represented by clouds.
That's a key feature. It's because problems rarely fit neatly into one box. Challenges can fluidly move between them, which demands constant reassessment from the leader.
Okay, so let's map these 4 main domains. Where do we start?
We start with simple.
Simple. This is the ordered domain. Known solutions exist, and the cause and effect relationships are obvious to everyone.
Right. The response here is immediate and standardized. You sense the situation, you categorize it, and you respond. Think of standard operating procedures, checklists, or just routine logistical tasks. This is the domain of efficiency, best practices.
Okay, next up is complicated. This is still an ordered domain, but it requires specialized knowledge.
Correct. In the complicated domain, the structure is still ordered, but you need an expert to see the cause and effect. This is the domain of the known unknowns.
So the leader knows there's a problem, but the how or who to solve it requires a specialist.
Exactly, like a master mechanic or a surgeon. You need an expert, but once that expert diagnoses the situation, they can apply a known, repeatable solution. Ambiguity increases here, but the underlying mechanism is still discoverable and predictable.
Now we enter the territory of adaptation, the complex domain.
This is where things get really interesting. Complex is unordered. This is the realm of true adaptive challenges, where cause and effect are only discernible in retrospect. You can't predict the outcome of your action with any certainty.
So you can only try something, see what happens, and then learn from it.
That's it exactly. You can't analyze your way to the right answer.
So if I can't predict, what is the required leader action in the complex domain?
The framework suggests that leaders must probe to gain information, then sense and make sense of the new data they get from that probe, and then respond with appropriate actions. The leader is, in essence, experimenting.
Which requires a culture of iterative learning. Small experiments that are safe to fail.
Yes, and that's critical. If you try to apply a large-scale, complicated solution here, you risk catastrophic failure because you just won't know the full ramifications of your actions.
That's a key distinction, isn't it?
Yeah.
The only way to move forward in complexity is through these small, carefully managed experiments. And that requires organizational patience, which, well, that's often in short supply during a crisis.
Absolutely. Now, we hit the last main domain, chaotic. The domain of the truly unknowable.
Chaotic is turbulent. There's no manageable pattern, and cause and effect are impossible to determine. You are in a full-blown crisis, and the system is breaking down.
And this environment requires a different response. The leader must immediately act to staunch the bleeding, then sense what happened from that immediate action, and only then respond.
There's no time for analysis.
No time for analysis or even probing. Stabilization is paramount.
But the adaptive leadership analysis notes something really fascinating about the chaotic domain. It says it's also the best place for leaders to impel innovation. Why is that?
Because all the constraints that usually stifle creativity are suddenly gone. When there is no frame of reference to follow, and the old way of doing things has clearly collapsed or never even existed, necessity drives entirely novel solutions.
So if you are a leader in chaos, you have permission to break the existing rules.
You have to, because the rules are clearly not working. However, operating the complex and chaotic domains is where misdiagnosis leads to the most catastrophic failures.
Which brings us back to another devastating case study of misreading complexity on a massive strategic scale. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Yes, the source material speaks directly to the failure of senior political and military leadership in the lead-up to the post-war occupation. The problem of governance, reconstruction, and counterinsurgency was fundamentally adaptive and complex.
Required a probe, sense, respond approach.
It did, and it required organizational flexibility. But according to the sources, it was framed by national leadership as a mere technical problem. Quick conventional force deployment, followed by an immediate handoff to a stable local government.
So the technical problem destroying the existing regime was accomplished very quickly. The complex adaptive problem, winning the peace, that was the real friction point.
Precisely. The sources detail that Army experts suggested a post-war occupation force of around 300,000 soldiers to guarantee safety and stability during that adaptive phase. But this expert advice was ignored. The Secretary of Defense and his deputy publicly downplayed that figure, citing a need for only 30,000.
So they were applying a technical solution, a fast, light, conventional force, to a complex, adaptive challenge that demanded sustained presence, cultural understanding, and nation-building capacity.
If you look at it through that Sinifin lens, they were treating a complex or maybe even chaotic problem as if it were merely complicated. They believe the experts already knew the answer of 30,000 troops and that a known solution could just be applied.
Instead of recognizing they needed to probe and sense the post-invasion environment.
Yes. This highlights the danger when leaders are intellectually locked into a predetermined course of action. They ignore or dismiss data that challenges their existing worldview.
And that failure to acknowledge complexity, the inability to probe, sense, and respond, ultimately resulted in a protracted conflict and immense cost. It directly violates the principles of mental agility that are reinforced in Army leadership and the profession.
Mental agility is the ability to think flexibly. It helps leaders react to change and adapt to dynamic situations that are inherent to military operations. It prevents fixation on the wrong problems or poor solutions. To lead adaptively, you must balance facts, question assumptions, and be prepared to take the least bad decision when there are no good ones.
And ignoring the 300,000 troop recommendation meant those leaders were mentally locked into a technical, conventional solution for an adaptive, asymmetrical reality.
So the lesson from both the Panama Canal and the Iraq occupation is that the biggest threat to adaptability is often the leader's own internal resistance to intellectual discomfort. They prioritize comfort and affirmation over the difficult work of challenging their own assumptions.
Okay, let's transition now from the abstract challenge of diagnosis to the concrete reality of operations. How does a leader actually embody this adaptability and influence the environment, particularly within the framework of military doctrine?
Well, we first have to understand the environment we're trying to influence, as it's laid out in the Doctrine publication operations. Leaders must account for 5 domains. That's land, maritime, air, space, and cyberspace.
And they have to view those domains through 3 critical dimensions.
Yes, the physical, the information, and the human dimensions. That structure is vital because it ensures leaders look beyond just the immediate tactical landscape.
So break that down for us.
The doctrine defines war as an act of force. That's the physical dimension. To compel, that's the information dimension, the decision-making and behavior of enemy forces, and that is the human dimension.
So while tactical operations often prioritize achieving a physical advantage,
finding and destroying the enemy.
right, the source material is explicit that the human dimension is the ultimate decider.
It absolutely is. Let's spend more time on the human and information dimensions because those are inherently adaptive. The physical is often technical. You move the force, you apply fire. But influencing information and human will requires adaptability.
So what does the human dimension encompass?
It encompasses people, their interactions, their decision-making, and crucially, their will to act and fight. This emerges from a complex interrelationship of culture, emotion, and behavior. An adaptive leader has to influence this dimension by affecting attitudes, beliefs, motivations, and perceptions.
You're essentially engaging in a hearts and minds campaign, which is the definition of an adaptive challenge.
Exactly. And the information dimension. You defined it as to compel. In our modern, highly interconnected environment, this is critical, especially in that gray zone of geopolitical friction, isn't it?
It's the adaptive dimension of control. The information dimension is not just about communication, it's about managing the narrative, conducting influence operations, countering disinformation, and shaping perceptions among allies, neutral parties, and adversaries.
And if you're operating in a complex environment, your physical actions are immediately broadcast and interpreted globally. The adaptive leader has to recognize that every single action taken on the physical battlefield simultaneously generates information effects.
And those effects have to compel the enemy's will, or bolster your allies' will.
Yes. So the adaptive leader is fundamentally an agent of change, not just a manager of processes.
So how does Army leadership and the profession define the qualities required for this kind of leadership?
Well, it says adaptive leaders encourage others to recognize that conditions are changing, and they build consensus as that change occurs. To become truly adaptable, leaders must constantly challenge their previous ideas and assumptions by seeking out novel and unfamiliar situations.
The source material warns pretty starkly that leaders who remain safely inside their comfort zone relying only on their current education, training, and experience, are the least likely to recognize or understand inevitable changes.
They'll be rigid when flexibility is required.
That emphasis on deliberately seeking discomfort is really telling. You have to practice adaptation before the crisis hits.
And you need the right mindset. Adaptability requires open-mindedness, the ability to consider multiple perspectives, avoiding premature conclusions, and a willingness to take calculated risks and overcome setbacks.
So if you aren't prepared to fail safely in training, you'll be paralyzed by the fear of failure when the pressure is on in a real conflict.
Absolutely. This connects directly to the concept of presence. This isn't just about looking sharp in a uniform, it's about projecting competence and confidence in dynamic situations, especially when the environment is complex.
Right. Presence, as described in Army leadership and the profession, is critical because it's how others perceive the leader based on their outward demeanor, actions, and words.
And subordinates quickly detect inauthenticity, especially when stress is high. Leaders must be comfortable in their own skin, demonstrating confidence that's tempered with humility. If you say you value adaptability, but you penalize subordinates who try new things, your presence is fundamentally inauthentic.
It's the old adage of walk the talk, but amplified by the environment. If leaders are able to perform what they ask others to do, or at least share the danger,
that generates a positive reputation that significantly contributes to their effective presence and, critically, builds trust.
And the historical example of Lieutenant General Eichelberger at Buna in 1942 is just a powerful illustration of this adaptive presence.
It really is. The 32nd Infantry Division was stuck, they were demoralized, suffering from disease, and making almost no progress against a determined Japanese defense. General Douglas MacArthur sent Eichelberger with instructions that demanded radical adaptive action. He told him to, quote, remove all officers who won't fight.
That's a tough technical order, but it required an adaptive approach to implement. So what was Eichelberger's adaptive action?
He immediately addressed both the physical and human dimensions. He fixed the technical problems, correcting critical supply and medical issues. But his most adaptive action was solving the crisis of confidence. He replaced commanders who lacked the disciplined, aggressive attitude required, but he did so by leading from the front.
Detail that for us. What did that look like?
Eichelberger was frequently near the front lines, wearing his rank openly, enduring the exact same conditions as his soldiers. He demonstrated an absolute willingness to share danger and hardship. He didn't just send orders from the rear. He personally validated the situation and showed his men that their commander was present, competent, and committed to their survival and success.
So that personal presence, that willingness to share risk, it reversed the demoralization. It changed the human dimension of the operational environment.
And it gave him a first-hand appreciation for the situation that centralized command and control systems just couldn't convey. This led to better visualization and better decision-making.
And this leads us perfectly to that critical metaphorical act of the adaptive leader, getting on the balcony. Eichelberger was close to the dance floor, but he didn't stay there indefinitely.
The famous anecdote for this is from the Battle of Ayadrang, where Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore had to be physically restrained.
Right. Moore was in the thick of the fighting, coordinating critical actions like troop movements, airstrikes, artillery. He was focused on the immediate technical and tactical problems.
But as the tempo increased, he got trapped on the dance floor of combat, and he was losing the perspective necessary for synchronization.
And his sergeant major had to physically intervene, shouting, "Sir, if you don't find some cover, you're going to go down, and if you go down, we all go down."
That intervention just perfectly encapsulates the paradox of commanding forward. Getting on the balcony is the metaphorical act of stepping back cognitively, if not physically, to gain perspective.
So in complex, fast-moving situations, the leader has to resist that temptation to micromanage or get trapped in the immediate crisis.
If you are too focused on the technical problem right in front of you, the direct firefight, you lose the ability to perform the crucial sense step required by the complex domain of the Sinafin framework.
And the perspective gained from the balcony is the only way to manage convergence, the concerted employment of capabilities across multiple domains that is so central to success in operations. If Moore had gone down, the unit's ability to synchronize air support, artillery, and troop movements, a complex adaptive task, would have failed completely.
The adaptive leader must be close enough to influence and show presence, like Eichelberger, but far enough away to maintain the strategic perspective necessary to make the high-level decisions only they can make. It is a constant, difficult balance between immersion and detachment.
So we've established that adaptability requires intense intellectual rigor and presence from the individual leader. But an organization only thrives in complexity if adaptation is built into its institutional requirements.
That's right. It can't just be one person.
Let's talk about how the Army ensures institutional adaptability through the concepts of leadership, authority, and mission command.
Well, McCollum and Shea make a key distinction about leadership versus positional authority. Effective adaptive leadership requires an inclusive approach, and it emphasizes that anyone can exhibit leadership, not just those with the rank on their collar.
And the doctrine notes that rigidly hierarchical organizations can often be the least receptive to new learning.
Because well-entrenched cultures resist change, hierarchy can protect the status quo, even when the status quo is failing.
And that inflexibility is deadly in a dynamic environment. So the institution has to rely on trust to enable influence and adaptation.
Yes. Army leadership in the profession details that trust builds over time through mutual respect, shared understanding, and common experiences. People naturally accept the influence of those they trust, and leaders build that trust by demonstrating competence, their technical and tactical expertise, and crucially, sound judgment.
And this necessary foundation of trust leads directly into the organizational framework designed specifically for adaptability in complexity. Mission Command.
Mission command is the Army's approach to command and control that empowers subordinate decision-making and decentralized execution that's appropriate to the situation. It's essential because, as the doctrine states, no single person can make every important decision or keep up with simultaneous requirements in combat.
The velocity of conflict just outpaces centralized control.
Completely. It's the philosophical foundation for fighting in the complex and chaotic domains where communication may be degraded or impossible, and fleeting opportunities must be seized instantly.
You delegate authority and control, which fosters what the doctrine calls disciplined initiative.
And that's the key. Subordinate leaders are given the commander's intent, the desired end state, and then they're empowered to figure out the means of achieving it, which often requires them to adapt instantly based on changing conditions.
There's a great example of this from the Gulf War in 1991, crosstalk in the desert with 7 Corps.
A vivid example of mission command in action.
So detail that operational moment for us.
Lieutenant General Frederick Franks, the Corps commander, received a spot report. 55 Iraqi tanks had crossed the Kuwaiti border and were engaging coalition forces. This could have signaled a major, unexpected preemptive strike.
And before Franks could even issue detailed orders.
2 of his subordinate commanders, the Aviation Brigade Commander and the Armored Cavalry Regiment Commander, called in with immediate, correct, and coordinated responses.
They acted instantly without waiting for continuous guidance.
No, and they didn't need the centralized command and control system to fully process and disseminate orders. Their actions were built on intense prior training, teamwork, and crucially, trust among the key players of the SEF Corps team.
They just understood the higher commander's intent.
They did. And they acted to achieve the desired end state, even as conditions were rapidly changing. The aviation commander alerted 2 attack helicopter battalions that could respond in 30 minutes. The Armored Cavalry Regiment commander ordered his entire regiment to blocking positions and deployed scouts. That is disciplined initiative in action.
And for that kind of decentralized execution to work in the complex domain, leaders must be comfortable with accepting risk. If subordinates fear failure, they will never act with initiative.
Risk, uncertainty, and chance are inherent to all military operations and all complex leadership challenges. Commanders have to delegate risk acceptance through clear commander's intent.
And crucially, to build the required judgment and trust for combat, leaders must accept risk during training.
Yes, that is so important. Sometimes that means allowing subordinates to accept excessive tactical risk in a controlled environment as a teaching point, enabling them to learn the boundaries of boldness and judgment.
So the critical piece for the learner is this. You have to accept risk in a controlled environment to build the judgment needed for real operations. If the organization practices risk aversion in training, it becomes rigid and incapable of executing mission command when the pressure is highest.
Subordinates must be developed and empowered to operate under their own responsibility when communications are degraded or fleeting opportunities arise. As the doctrine emphasizes, waiting for perfect intelligence and synchronization might increase risk or close a window of opportunity. Mission command is fundamentally a philosophy that demands adaptive boldness.
Now, on the flip side of this adaptive organizational structure, we have the ultimate failure mode, the leadership behavior that entirely strips an organization of its ability to adapt.
Counterproductive leadership.
Exactly.
And Army leadership and the profession is explicit about this. Counterproductive leadership violates core competencies and values. It leaves organizations in a worse condition, it destroys morale, and it degrades readiness. The behaviors associated with this are just catastrophic to adaptation because they break the trust required for mission command.
What specific behaviors are identified in the source materials as counterproductive?
They include abusive behaviors, things like bullying, belittling, ridiculing, or demonstrating incompetence by acting confidently without the actual expertise to justify it, which makes subordinates suspicious.
It undermines everything.
It decreases followers' well-being, their engagement, and it undermines the organization's readiness and ability to accomplish the mission in the long term.
So an abusive or incompetent leader creates an organizational climate that is rigid and inflexible because it stifles the flow of adaptive information.
Precisely. No one is willing to risk sharing negative information or offering an adaptive solution that might contradict the leader's initial and often incorrect assessment. This effectively freezes the organization in the complex or chaotic domains.
So when you silence initiative and you punish failure,
You ensure that the organization can only handle technical problems, and it will collapse when facing an adaptive one. The required organizational adaptation becomes impossible. In a world of increasing complexity and speed, that lack of adaptability due to poor leadership is the ultimate strategic vulnerability. Outro mode.
this has been a profound deep dive into the essence of adaptive leadership, blending leadership theory with hard-won operational doctrine. We've covered the entire spectrum from intellectual diagnosis to organizational implementation.
We did. We covered the necessary distinction between technical challenges, which require known expertise and procedure, and adaptive challenges, which require people to fundamentally change their ways of operating, their beliefs, and their attitudes.
And we saw that misdiagnosing the latter as the former is just a guaranteed pathway to failure, as demonstrated by those lessons from the Panama Canal.
We also looked at the intellectual rigor required to navigate complexity using the Sinefin framework, knowing when to sense, categorize, and respond versus when to probe, sense, and respond, or sometimes just act first in chaos.
And we established that mental agility and the willingness to challenge assumptions, even expert advice, are essential leader attributes, particularly in complex adaptive tasks like post-conflict stabilization.
And finally, we detailed how the adaptive organization thrives, not through centralized control, but through the empowerment of subordinate leaders operating with disciplined initiative, built on a bedrock of mutual trust and shared understanding, all enabled by the mission command philosophy. Adaptive leaders must constantly challenge previous ideas and assumptions by seeking out new, novel, and unfamiliar situations to test their assumptions and prepare for the stress of change.
So now for our final provocative thought for you, the learner. Given that many challenges in your professional or personal life, like improving team efficiency or changing a routine, may actually be adaptive challenges requiring you to change your own behavior or beliefs, what is one technical solution you are currently pursuing that might actually require you to stop working on the dance floor, get on the balcony, and change your underlying approach to the problem?
Go find that adaptive gap and confront the discomfort.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Until next time.